So for those of you who haven't met me yet, I'm Zystro. I'm with Organic Seed Alliance, and this morning, myself and Edmund, Jeanine, and Patrick will be talking about the value of trials for your farm as a grower, as a seed producer, as a plant breeder, of doing on-farm plant breeding, and in addition to the value, a little bit of how to conduct trials and some examples of how trials have been conducted and some of the successes and challenges around that. So I'm going to start with kind of the big picture overview of the nuts and bolts of how to conduct a meaningful trial. Thank you. So, like I said, trials are good for more than just if you're a seed grower, though we've been talking a lot about seed this weekend, and there's a lot of power in trials for seed, but I will just say to everyone who's not necessarily thinking about growing seed or being a plant breeder, trials can be useful for everyone. If you want to find the best varieties for your farm, knowing how to conduct a trial, how to source, look widely for sources of potential promising material, how to get good information about how those performed on your farm, can give you a real leg up in terms of having the best productivity, answering specific challenges for your farm. Just because something is advertised in the catalog, or you talk to a seed rep and they say this has been great, the seed company, unless they're your neighbor, they don't necessarily know your farm. You know your farm best, and you'll know how the best way to know how something's going to perform on your farm is grow it on there, and trials are a great way to do that. In addition, if you are interested in growing seed, in selling seed, in doing your own on-farm breeding, trials are really the first step here, establishing what performs well, knowing kind of the landscape of the different varieties that are already out there that could be in your catalog, that you could be producing for seed, or that you could be choosing as potential parts of a breeding project. So when we're thinking about doing a trial, sometime perhaps in the winter time, when we have a little bit more time for planning, what are some of the first planning steps here? Usually a good trial, there are plenty of exceptions to all of these rules, but in general, trials are better when you have some focus to that trial. It's not just, what grows best on my farm. It's more of, I'm looking for a specific species, even a specific crop type. I want to grow some, round red slicing tomatoes. I want a yellow summer squash. I want, winter squash that has a specific disease resistance. So understanding, narrowing it down to the crop species, and then even to a specific, market class, and then thinking about what the goals are. Is this something where you're like, I'd like to be able to extend the season a little, later into the winter or later into the summer of this crop? Oh, I really have a problem with the specific disease, or I'd love to get something that that really pops out at the farmer's market in terms of color. Knowing what those goals are, all of that will help inform the rest of how the trial takes place, and it'll also help you decide what you put in the trial, because you have limited space, time, and effort, and so thinking carefully at the start about what you want to pick out of the seed catalogs, or get from your neighbors, or get from your friendly public plant breeders to include in your trial, will increase the likelihood that you end up finding something that you like at the end of it. So thinking about varieties to go in the trial, how do you pick them? Again, first that's stepping back to those goals and those market class, and then thinking about one place is thinking about what are some of the most important commercial varieties in your region. If you already know that because it's a crop that you grow and sell a lot of, you've got that knowledge built in. If you have a neighbor that's a commercial producer of those, you can pick their brain. One of the strategies that we at Organic Seed Alliance we've used sometime, if we don't know, is talk to the produce buyer at your local grocery store and say, who's your best producer of XYZ crop. Get their name and then call them up and say, what are you growing and why? That's a way to get a handle on what some of those really, what the best growers are already, growing. Then, more, nationwide, you might want to, look outside of just, what people are growing now, but what are some of the other kind of up and coming and, promising things from seed catalogs. So talking to seed reps, especially people that have experienced your region, ask them, what has everybody been using and has been satisfied with, and maybe what are some new things that seem like they have a lot of promise. Likewise, older standards, varieties that have been grown and perform well in your area for a long, long time. There's a reason that some varieties don't get dropped. There's more than one reason. Sometimes it's just because they have a name and they have, some loyalty, and other times it's because those have been proven over time. They're not necessarily, a flash in the pan new variety that comes and goes, but something that's been around for, a decade plus. There may be a good reason for that variety. And then, of course, if you're working on, breeding projects and seed saving projects, include your own stuff in there. You want to see how it stacks up against everything else. Okay, so a lot about what my talk is going to be thinking about is this idea that when you do a trial, you're putting a lot of time and effort into growing something that, instead of having just a single variety in your field, now you're dealing with 4, 6, 10, 20 different things maybe. And that takes more time, takes more effort, and not only you're growing lots of things now, you're collecting information about each of these things. All that is extra time and investment. At the end of the season, you'd like to feel like all of that paid off in some way. You'd like to have some confidence that if you saw something that looked better, it was genuinely because it did perform, or you feel more confident that it's because it really did perform better on your farm, and not just because of some kind of what we call environment effect, where maybe it just got a little more fertilizer, or it was in the sun when the rest of the stuff was in the shade, or it was in a little bit more of a silty part of your soil instead of the sandier spot, and so it was able to hold a little more water and nutrients in that particular patch of soil. So a lot of the steps in making a trial that you can feel confident in the results from come from reducing and accounting for field variation. And there's kind of two different ways you can do that, or two different ways you want to do both of these things. And the first is in how you select your trial site and how you manage it. So if you've worked on your farm for a while, you probably have a sense of parts of your field that are relatively, or your fields that are relatively uniform, in parts where it's like, okay, I know if there was an old, riverbed, it's all gravelly soil that runs, crossways through a part of a field, you might not want to put the trial in the middle of that, because half that trial is going to be on this gravelly soil and half's not. And all of a sudden now, plants might be short and tall, productive and not productive because of, it being on gravel versus not. So kind of picking a spot, if you grew a cover crop or something that covered your whole, a big chunk of your field, that's a good opportunity to kind of look and see, okay, is there a spot where everything kind of grew uniformly? That could be the borders of where you might put a variety trial. And then there's the management side of it. So if you're growing a variety trial, what you'd like to do is manage that trial as much as possible in the same way across the whole trial. So you'd like to set up your irrigation so that everything's getting equal irrigation. You'd like to cultivate the whole trial, the same way at the same time. This is, as the trials get bigger, these are things that become more and more relevant, where say you only got through, weeding, half of your trial, and then life got busy, then you couldn't get back to weeding for another week and a half, and now that other half's all overgrown and plants got a little bit stressed from that competition. Now you might be seeing a difference between stuff that was on the better weeded half and the not better weeded half. And now those differences aren't because one of those varieties is better or not, just because one got more stressed out. Stepping back, things like the being able to cultivate and harvest equally, all of this lends itself to the idea of really starting at a scale that you can feel confident in handling, and doing a good job of, with that idea that at the end of the season you'd like to feel like all that effort you put in paid off. So it's exciting in the wintertime to make big plans, and it's really hard to not include every single possible variety that you found that looks like it might be good. But if you go really big and then you can't actually get it all weeded, or you can't get it all harvested, then you've put all that effort in for less valuable information at the end. So thinking about how to keep it as manageable as possible is going to mean that you're going to feel good about the results at the end, or more likely to. So same thing, irrigation, cultivation, fertilization, try and fertilize the same way. Also, thinking about what the prior crop was and what the cover cropping regime was. You'd like to not split your trial down and say, okay, half of my trial field was on ground that was grown to like a legume last year, and half was grown to corn, some other other type crop. Now there's going to maybe be some differences in terms of available fertility, that splits that trial down the middle. So thinking about how you fertilize, what was the cover cropping, what was the past cropping, and try and make all those things as uniform within your trial field as possible. Same thing harvesting. Try and harvest everything the same time, as close as possible. Okay, so that's one piece of how to reduce this possible confounding effect of all of these differences that might be in the field. The other way to do it is to try to account for the fact that that the field's going to be variable. And there's kind of two ways I want to show you for how to do that. One is through what's called a replicated trial. And this just means that you plant every variety more than one time in more than one place. So for example, if you had your trial on 3 beds or 3 rows, and there was 5 varieties in it, these are numbered 1 through 5, but these would have names probably, you wouldn't just plant one, variety number 1 in just one place and call it good, because maybe this corner up here, is a little bit more shaded, or maybe it's the spot that's closer to your field road where the soil's more compacted. There could be lots of reasons why, this corner is not, it looks different than that corner. So what you do is you plant one randomly scattered, one time in this bed, one time in that bed, and also one time in that bed. And then you can kind of see, okay, does it look good in all these places throughout my field? Now I'm feeling more confident that this really is good, and not just because it happens to be, in really prime part of the field. So you can see that's how all these are done, across the field. This is called, and these are done, this is called a randomized block trial, and the reason is that you kind of plant all the varieties in these 3, in this case 3 blocks. And that way, so you can also just do what's called a completely randomized trial, where you just say, okay, we'll just plant, one can go, anywhere in the field as long as I plant it 3 times. The advantage of this block is if there is some kind of, say, soil gradient going down this way, that you're more likely to have a chance for every variety to have experienced all the different gradients in your field. So this is called a replicated trial. You can see the minus of this is that now it's taking more space. Another thing I just want to point out while we have this picture, if at all possible, if you're growing this crop already commercially, it gets slightly easier, but you'd like to not put a trial right up at the edge of a field. You'd like to have some kind of border. Ideally, that same crop would form a border around it. And that border serves as a buffer, because the edges of a field are always a little bit different than the middle of a field, right? Those are the places, again, where there might be a field road here. The irrigation setup might not quite reach the outside of the beds. All those things mean that usually the edges see what we call edge effects. And so if you can have a little buffer for your trial, it makes it more likely that everything is the same in the middle of it. So that's a replicated trial, and there's a lot of strength to it, but it does limit the amount of varieties you can grow, increases the space. Another way to do it is what we call an augmented trial. And the idea of an augmented trial is that you have what's called a quote-unquote check variety. And this variety, or varieties, you can do more than one, is just sort of a check on your trial to see how much variation are you seeing in your trial. Does it? So if you've got kind of a really standard commercial variety, especially something you've got experience in growing and know how it performs usually, plant it several times around your trial field. And then as you're harvesting and taking notes on your trial, you can see, okay, did this corner up here where the check was planted, the check was way bigger up there than it was down over here. Well, I should take that into account when I'm considering how well the varieties next to this really good-looking check did versus, when that same variety was planted over here or over there. So the idea is, rather than having to replicate and plant multiple times every single variety, you're planting most of your varieties just one time, or maybe, depending on your size, maybe you're planting them 2 times instead of 3 or more, but you scatter a check variety randomly throughout the trial to give you a little bit more of a handle on being able to see that whether or not there is variation in your field and kind of what that variation looks like in terms of how it looks in space across your field. The advantage of this, as you can see, is that you can look at more varieties, doesn't take as much space. The disadvantage is that you don't have quite the same sort of handle on, okay, how would variety of H really have looked if it had been over on this side of the field? We don't see that. There's a little more kind of inferring and guessing that has to happen based on how it looked, how the check that was close to it looked. So, how you lay out the trial, usually you want equal sized, what we would call plots, little individual sections of a bed or a row that are where you plant the different varieties, so you can sort of measure that out and divide it. Okay, I've got a 100-foot bed and I've got 10 varieties. I'm going to divide this into 10 feet for each variety. Then put stakes. One of the kind of easier ways to randomize is you can go ahead and just take all your stakes, write the variety names on them, and just throw them in the air and grab them, whichever ones you get. That's the variety that you plant. What I would say with any trial is that it's really important to not just rely on these stakes for knowing what is where. These stakes, Sharpies wash off, they get run over and broken by equipment. Make a map, write it down, take a cell phone picture of that map so it's electronic as well, because it's so disappointing to get through. If one of these stakes breaks off, you can usually work backwards and figure out, okay, I know what the rest of the stuff was. I know what the missing one is. If 2 break off or go missing, then it starts to get a lot harder to start guessing. So, better and easier to make a map and make that electronic. So, how do you evaluate the trial? And this is, again, something that, though I'm talking about it now, something to think about in the wintertime. And like I said, in terms of thinking about the size of your trial, how many varieties and how big those, each of those individual plots are going to be. When we're talking about evaluating a trial, what kind of information you're collecting, I would encourage you to think hard about what is the really important information you need to know and what is like the least cumbersome way of collecting that information. Because same kind of thing, you don't want to have this big ambitious plan and then it's the middle of the season, you're busy just trying to get your produce to market, and your plan of collecting, measuring, the individual length of each cucumber, out of your field, like you're like, I can't do this, forget about it, right? So think hard about, okay, maybe pick 4 or 5 or fewer things that you really care about, collecting information about, and think, about how to collect it really simply. I remember Michael Mazurek one time had a good picture of, I think, was this for cucumbers maybe? He's saying it was like, using sort of just like the bin system for like, okay, how many, if I'm harvesting already out of this trial, how many bins did I fill with my cucumbers? Instead of trying to count individual cucumbers or weigh them, it's just like, okay, this one's a 5 binner, this is a 1 binner. Gives you information, lets you see the differences, is already part of your harvest plan. So think about how that data collection can just fit into how you're already going to be harvesting out of this. Keep it simple, keep it to a minimum, and think also about sort of the the timing of those evaluations, both in terms of what's the time that's going to give you the best chance to see the differences that you care about between these varieties. If you care about how well did they grow, and compete with weeds in the early season, make sure you put that on the calendar, because you're not going to see those differences if you wait, until, the crops are fully grown. Those differences may have disappeared. Likewise, thinking about timing of evaluations, make sure you think hard about when you've got some ambitious, data collection in the middle of your, crunch time on your farm. So there's kind of 2 ways. There's more than 2, but I'm going to give you 2 ways that you might be collecting information. One is actually like measuring things. So, having a scale out there as you're harvesting, putting the bins on scales, collecting those weights. The other way is what we call scoring, which is just where you make up a scale. You say, okay, I care about how, how much downy mildew I'm seeing on, these different varieties. And what you would do is you just walk the field, you find your worst looking plot, and you would call that a 1. 1 just equals worst. You're giving a made up number. And then you find your best looking plot, and you say, okay, this is a 9 for disease resistance. And then you kind of try and find your middle of the road, and that's a 5. Once you have kind of those flag posts set, then you can go back to the start of the trial and say, okay, how did this one compare? This was better than that one that the worst looking thing, but it's still not very good. It's not as good as the middle. We'll call it a 3. Or, oh, this one looks almost as good as that one that I saw that looked like the best one in the field. I'm going to call this, a 7 or an 8. And you just walk the field and give it numbers like that. It's really one of the things I'd say for a trial, there's kind of 2 ways to approach this. One is that what I said, which is that, collecting this information and setting those 1s, 5s, and 9s based on what you're seeing in the trial that day. Because the tendency, whenever anyone does this kind of scoring, is that you're like, well, once upon a time, 10 years ago, I saw, this really terrible variety. That was really a 1. I don't see anything like that in the field now. This is like a 4, and then this other one, oh, this is like a 5, and this is like a 6. And now everything is like a 4, 5, or 6. At the end of the day, you can't like decide. You're like, I don't know, they all were about the same, because they weren't as bad as the worst thing I've ever seen. They weren't as good as the best thing I've ever seen. So trying to spread your data. The minus of that is it does make it harder to compare if you do this year to year. So, that's something to kind of take note of is, if you're scoring like that, where you're, really basing it on a relative scale for that day, the next year, it gets a little harder to see how things look the next year. Yeah, Edmund.
Yeah, I use a relative scale for downy mildew foliage evaluation, but I've tried to make that consistent through the different years and the different trials, just because it helps me compare different years.
Yeah. And it's something like, for example, you could, do this like this the first year, and then if you do these trials again the next year, you could, adjust a little and say, okay, how did this compare to last year? But it does get hard because now you're having to remember back a year ago, which,
Or
Mark?
we were just to say, okay, this is 2020.
Yeah.
Here's this year's 1, click. Here's this year's 5, click. Here's this year's 9, click.
Yes, I was just about to say that, which is two other really important things in collecting information. One is take notes, keep actual hand, like here's why I like this, or here's what I saw, written, narrative information is really, really valuable because, numbers alone at the end of the season or the next year, you're just like, I don't know what that meant, or why I said that. And the next thing is take photos. Your cell phone's really easy, just have it out there, just click, click, click each time you're collecting data. It's so nice at the end of the year to be able to look at those, connect, the number with the, what you wrote for notes with the picture. Now you've got, a much more holistic view. You had a question or comment? Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to also say about the photos. When you're taking the photos of each individual plot, it's very helpful to set yourself up such that, the angle of each plot is uniform in all your photographs, so you can have the best possible comparison.
Yeah, that's good advice. Yeah.
Another thing, before you take a photo of the plot, take a photo of the stake, so you know what plot it is.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Having a way to keep track of those photos, very helpful. So, last slide here was that doing a trial for 1 year can get you a lot of information, and is certainly going to get you light years ahead of just relying on a seed catalog or a seed representative. Each year, as everyone knows here, is different. It's going to be hotter, colder, different stresses are going to come. There's also going to be new varieties that pop up and old varieties that drop away. And so if this is something that's important to you, kind of like refresh your knowledge. Maybe it isn't even like the very next year, but 2-3 years down the road, say, okay, let's take another look at this crop that I'm growing and think about, are there newer things that are out on the market that I want to take a look at, or just a chance to get a sense of like, okay, it looked really good in this year, but it was kind of an unusual year when I did that trial for this and that reason. It was really hot and dry, and I'd like to do a trial again and see if I capture, a different kind of weather pattern. And so, doing trials multiple years really starts to get you a really robust set of information that gives you even more confidence. What I would say, it says here, is that you don't necessarily, if you've done trials, you don't have to keep, there's part of an appeal of like, I just like to do the same trial, and that way I can really compare last year's trial results with this year's trial results. At a certain point, don't keep carrying along the really lousy varieties. Get those out of the trial. Make room for, new stuff, promising stuff. So that's all I had to share a little bit about the big picture overview. I'll say that if you want a helpful guide for conducting trials and more of this information, Organic Seed Alliance, we have a free publication on conducting on-farm variety trials. There's an example on the table over there, and you can get it from our website, seedalliance.org. You can download it for free, so take a look at that. And I'd like to hand it over to Edmund, I think, next, right?
And we're team teaching.
Okay, Edmund and Jeanine.
I want to say when I first started doing variety trials, it was because I went to a workshop that Jared led, and I definitely made use of that free publication, so definitely check that out.
And my one first piece of advice, the first time you do trials, is be reasonable in what you choose to do. We all get really excited and we put in a trial that's far too big. And remember, you've still got farms to run. So, make sure the first one is something that when you get done, you're gonna really have something useful. Even if it's just a couple varieties, replicated 3 times, do it well, get the hang of it. And yeah, because most people I see that do their first trial put in like 50 varieties. And it was a good idea in the beginning.
So most of the trials we do are as Commonwealth seed growers. We're also a seed production farm, but Commonwealth seed growers is kind of the umbrella that we do like breeding and trialing. So we do, it's just a little bit about what we do. Jared has covered a good bit of the material I have in some of these slides, so we may go through some of them faster. But this is just a list of why you might want to do a variety trial, and there's some different ones on here. Like maybe there's a F1 hybrid that's being discontinued and you need to find a replacement. Maybe you're not sure which seed stock to use of a particular variety. There can be a lot of variation between different things that actually have the same variety name. Of course, it's an essential starting place for breeding work. It's important to keep doing trials as you're doing breeding work. Yeah, even if you're not doing any of that kind of stuff, just figuring out what works on your farm. So I'm gonna have some like slides about how to do trials in general, but also like tell a story of like sort of the trajectory of my work with downy mildew trials and breeding. I showed this slide the other day, but I like it because it's kind of like about when I noticed that downy mildew was a big problem and started thinking about what to do with it. I was giving a farm tour and noticed that the crop looked really bad. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Like, look at this.
Instead of looking back.
We're just talking louder.
Yeah. Okay, I'll try. So this is 2013. I had gone to Jared and Michaela's talk at the SOG conference and got all excited about doing variety trials. And so, we noticed that downy mildew was a big problem on our farm. And Joyce, I don't know if I can do it. I'm sorry.
I'll keep poking, okay?
Yeah,
That'll
okay.
be my job.
So we decided to do this downy mildew cucumber and melon trial, and it was just an observation trial. But it was a great year because there's really heavy downy mildew, and some of the this is Debbie. Some of the varieties totally just died right away, didn't make any cucumbers, like there. And some of those were varieties that said they were resistant, which was like we could like disprove something or prove something right away.
Say just an observation trial compared to.
Yeah.
Very good question.
Because
There you
What's
go.
the difference
I
between
do
an
trials,
observation?
and I always want to take a trial. I observe everything.
Yeah.
So what's beyond the observation trial?
So an observation trial is what you call a trial that's not replicated. So there can be different levels of observation trials. Some of them you're just growing a bunch of stuff and kind of checking it out and getting impressions. Or you can do an observation trial where you are taking detailed data, but you just don't have replication. And this is a slide that tells you about different kinds of trials. Observation trials, replicated trials, augmented trials.
And I'd just like to chime in on that a little bit. That's one of the things I had notes on. Lots of us do observational trials all the time. Just spoke with Pat Battle this morning about, he did a real fun one and he just put a whole bunch of stuff out there, of all different kinds of cucurbits, but it's just one plot of each. You can learn a lot from that, but you don't want to be making economic decisions based on that. That's where you would find things that are really of interest, and then next year you would go ahead and replicate it. Okay.
Yeah, it's a good way to get started and check out a lot of different stuff and narrow down what you want to put in your replicated trial.
What's the difference between a seed company variety trial and on-farm variety trial? Why are those there?
Why are they, okay, I mean, these are kind of related categories, and these are kind of different ways of talking about trials, but who does variety trials? Universities do variety trials, seed companies do variety trials, and farmers do variety trials. Farmers do variety trials for a variety of reasons. It could be just for their farm, or it could be initiated by a university and the farmer is doing it. Yeah.
Just one real quick thing about sort of like why you would put in the effort to do replicated trial versus an observation trial. A lot of it does come down to, your goals. And for example, if you just want to look and see what different, tomato fruits look like, you've got a whole bunch of things. You're like, okay, there's all these new kind of heirloom types that are coming on the market. I want to see what, the fruits look like. That's something that's what we call really a highly heritable trait. It's something that pretty much is, you're gonna, if you see it in a single plot, you grab those and look at them, it's gonna tell you more or less what those fruits look like. If it's something like, okay, I want to know which of these winter squash is yielding the best, that has a lot more, the environment in the field has a lot more impact on those differences in yield, and having replication gives you more. That's where you get more confidence to say, okay, I feel more confident that this really did yield better because of the variety, not just because of where it was put in the field.
And to those last points with those different types too, there are several people in this room who are involved with university-led on-farm variety trials. And so several of us in this room have projects going on. We will be doing those trials on research stations, and then we'll go ahead and also have growers do the same things. Because you all, when they're on farm, they're in a more real-life situation, dealing with your own equipment and the realities of the farm, where on the research station, we're controlling everything. And sometimes, well, so we think, and sometimes our results might be better than they could ever be in the real world. And I can tell you over my career how many times things have looked great on research stations, and then we get them on the farm, and they fail miserably for reasons that we never thought of to think about. So those more and more you're going to see people like us are doing both at the exact same time.
Another reason for on-farm trials, if you're a plant breeder, is that you want to know what traits farmers are actually looking for, and having farmers try stuff enables you to do that. So I've got some pictures of some observation trials I've done. This is, on the right, I did a pumpkin trial, very late planted trial of varieties I thought might be downy mildew resistant in 2018. And I found one that I thought was great, and I made a cross with it. And maybe that was too early to be making a cross with it, but that's what I did. And see what happens. And that's in the context of I can keep trying it, but it's nice to make a cross.
Can I just make a real quick point with this picture, which is that one of the challenges, or one of the balancing acts on a farm when you're doing trials, is that it's so much easier usually to just plant a really long bed to a trial. And it's like, okay, this bed is going to be my trial bed, and I'm just going to put all the varieties in a row down the, from one end to the other. The minus with that is it starts to get more and more likely that there's going to be differences between here and all the way down there. If at all possible, if you can split a trial up so that it gets as square as you can, and it's always a balancing act between what makes it easy on your farm and not, but the more square the trial is, the more likely, you're minimizing the distance between, where in the field the different plots are.
I have a sort of a flip side of that, which can be, sometimes it's more uniform along the whole row. And the other thing is that if you plant one row or two rows, you don't have to have a border. What do you think about that?
Because everything's on an
Because
edge.
everything's on a border.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just like a way to...
Yeah, you're treating everything the same.
Yeah.
Yep, I can see both sides.
Yeah, this is pepper squash, this is watermelon, and that's machada squash in the distance. And the machadas, for instance, I ended up not really having enough time to get a lot of good information. It definitely happens.
And I have a comment on this,
Yeah.
having done very poorly designed, not really trials, it's supposed to be a display garden, but it turned into some interesting information, which is that you have to understand the vigor of all your squash, because some squash are gonna overrun others,
Yeah,
and totally,
yeah. And
then you don't know if it's they weren't productive or they just got overwhelmed.
another thing with my cucurbit trials is usually I train the varieties separately so they're not running together. You'll see that in further slides. This is a trial we did this year, funded by Southern Exposure, and we were just trying out several different kinds of dent corn and dry corn. We were just planting one plot of each. We just wanted to see what they looked like. So it's not really a yield data trial. We wanted to get pictures and see what they looked like.
So
And,
how many counties did you do with that?
10 or 11. Is that what how many?
Was it manageable for the observation trial, pretty?
Yeah, it was pretty small. There we are, like looking at them. We did weigh the yields, but we're not gonna put too much stock in it.
And they weren't all crossing each other that close together?
There was some, yeah. But also we want to taste them. You know, we're gonna make grits out of
Corn
them.
trials are pretty unique that way, kind of a pain.
Yeah. It was all dry corn. So this is on the other side. This is a trial that we did that had 5 replications. It's a bacterial wilt trial we did last year. I'm going to talk more about that in a bit, actually. We kind of already covered that. Importance of on-farm trials. So I'm going to go back. So there was that picture of Debbie doing the 2013 observation trial with the cucurbit downy mildew. We wrote a SARE grant to do replicated trials the next year. So in 2014, we did somewhat similar but much bigger replicated trials with cucumbers, melons, and winter squash, and got a lot of great information out of it. Just real quick here, we had Waltham butternut as a border row, and in comparison to a lot of the tropical pumpkins that we put in the trial, it had really terrible disease resistance. So that was like, this is just a good graphic illustration. It's always nice when you have something that does terrible and something that does really well next to each other to take a picture and show it to people.
And it even shows more resistance because, of course, you have all those disease spores coming from the one that's doing terrible.
Yeah. Sometimes it's not fair though, because sometimes one of the varieties is earlier and it set its fruit earlier. But
I think the other thing is
Yeah.
sometimes it can be really disease resistant, but not all that covered. So just
Yeah.
to not assume that something has a lot of resistance, that's exactly the variety you want to grow.
Yeah.
Exciting for the breeder though.
Right, it's good genetics.
but when we do in our downy mildew trials, we'll measure yield so that we avoid, thinking that something that looks great that doesn't have any fruit on it is great.
It looks great because it's putting off the changeable.
Right.
The other end of the spectrum is those stratas with the ornamental size. They do great, they're productive, but who wants more?
Yeah. So thinking about what you're looking for.
Is there anything you do to encourage the growth of downy mildew so that you're sure that in that particular year you have high pressure that is? Do you do any
We-
inoculation or like making sure it's real damp?
Yeah, we just plant late.
Okay.
That's it.
And we will do that with our university trials, that we will actually bring disease in and inoculate. We very, very rarely will take that into our on-farm trials because it's a good way to get a bad reputation. But that's one of the advantages to us having both, is if we have a year like we're doing tomatoes and we aren't really getting late blight, we'll go ahead, often I will go to a farm and get late blight and then bring it back to the research
Okay.
stage.
You're not introducing it to the region.
No, we're very, very sensitive to that.
But the, we did this squash trial, and
Yeah.
doing it multiple years under multiple, like, right here you can get a lot of downy, but dry year you might get other issues, it wasn't just downy, but all sorts of.
Yeah.
But you can ask Jared, we have learned that if you want to do tomato late blight trials, that's a good way to prevent late blight from out the region whenever, am I
You don't get something like Georgia.
right?
Yeah.
Well, we don't get it in North Carolina when we want to test for it either.
Well, and Jeanine, you remember when we were doing this compost tea trial?
Mhm.
And we put out, I wouldn't do it because I could get lynched in South Toe Valley.
Yeah.
He put out late blight and watered every night and couldn't get it.
Yep.
Nighttime temperatures weren't right, his conditions weren't
Okay.
right.
Right.
Um,
Downy mildew is pretty sure.
Yeah, it always comes. It varies, and for us, it always comes. Some years it comes later. One of the things that came out of our variety trials, it kind of early on, was identifying varieties that Cornell had bred that had good downy mildew resistance, and then moving that on to seed production. It's a different project. Yeah.
It's 50% of the genetics is a sheet of paper on the table that tells you how you got the cucumber from that.
No, it's different. It's different genetics. Yeah. Michael Brad, please. Might be talking about them later. No. Okay.
No, and you said that you use trials to find different sources of resistance that complement this, so.
Yeah.
And the great thing there is that means it's not just relying on one source of resistance I had, so there's a bunch of stuff within this kind of.
One thing that happened with cucumber is all the cucumber varieties, or all the resistant varieties in the U.S. were derived from the same downy mildew resistance source, and that the disease mutated in the early 2000s, and all the cucumbers became non-resistant. So I think it's valuable to have this resistance source, and I'm developing a totally different resistance source, which I'm going to have some information on in a bit.
How are we on time, Jen?
We have 20 minutes.
Is that including the participants' time, or?
What's that? That's until the session is over.
Okay.
It's also 45 minutes between sessions.
Is it 45 this time?
But some people are gonna try to get together
A
in
session.
between session and talk about what.
So you've got just a couple minutes.
Right outside.
While he's looking for a couple things, a few things that I wanted to add in to make sure, when you're doing your observations, collecting data, and we talked about especially when you're scoring plots, you really should have the same person or same two people that do it all the time. Because even though you take pictures and you write detailed descriptions on what a 1 is and what a 5 is, you're not gonna do it the same. So as much as you can say, that's your job. That you're gonna do that on the watermelon trial. You're gonna do it and maybe have a backup person trained. So, with the scoring and we're still really bad about this, when you make your data sheets, there should be a little legend on all of them, okay? Because you're gonna put those, you're gonna have them in a notebook, and you're gonna pull them out a couple years later, and then you're trying to explain to Edmund what you did, and you're like, oh, what was that number 1 for? Or what was that variety? Make sure everything's got a legend with it.
And Jeanine, when you were doing trials with John Nilsson's stuff on tomatoes, I was there a day when you were going up close and doing all these evaluations and scoring, and I was back taking pictures from a distance, and I found patterns that you weren't seeing.
Yep. Well, and we do that. You can see that with my trials from year to year. When I have a plant pathologist, all the stuff is up really close. Yeah.
Something to consider as a farmer when you start getting into variety trials is that it might take up a lot of your time as a farmer, and then you can't devote as much time to other farm management, so it can be a labor challenge.
Which is why the SARE on-farm trials, you get the money for that, like he's done, and there's a lot of money out there for those trials, then you can hire someone, have the resources specifically for that, and do it really well, and it's not pulling from the rest of your operation.
That's a good idea. So yeah, sourcing material. The USDA germplasm bank is a really good resource. You want to not pull stuff out of there unless you're serious about it. That said, we've gotten a lot of really good varieties out of there that have gone into our breeding work. And here's just a few other ideas. Understand that there can be variation between different seed stocks that have the same variety name. When you let's see, where do I have this? When you make sure you make a good list of what you have, not only writing down the variety name, but also the organic status and the lot number. Lot number is important. Let's see. Okay, go through all these. Yeah, evaluation is important. It's important to figure out what you're going to evaluate ahead of time. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about this cucumber project that we've done in 2018 and 2019. The 2018 project had 2 variety trials and also breeding trials. I'll get to what that is. So the two variety trials, one was focused on bacterial wilt and the other on downy mildew. And I did it that way because if you're planting in really high downy mildew conditions, you might not be able to tell what's bacterial wilt and what's downy mildew. So I tried to have the bacterial wilt trial not have downy mildew in it, and vice versa. And the method for that was bacterial wilt was planted early and it wasn't covered with row cover, and the downy mildew trial was planted late and covered with row cover. But there's other things. Let's see. One of the things I wanted to show about that's the end of the trial. One of the things I wanted to say about this trial versus the downy mildew trial is that we didn't measure yield in the bacterial wilt trial. We just measured bacterial wilt, and as a way to really cut down on the labor. The downy mildew trial was our yield trial, but we figured if the plants die from bacterial wilt, they die, and that's, you don't want that. You don't need to know what the yield was. So, whereas in the downy mildew trial, you need a way to account for the issue of some varieties having foliage that looks great but not setting fruit. So the question is not how the foliage looks; it's how much productivity a plant can have in high downy mildew conditions. So that's why the yield is so important in the downy mildew trial. This is just going to show the trial on different dates. The row cover is because we had some damping off problems. I had to replant some things. And the stuff that I replanted wasn't part of the comparison, but I didn't want to just have empty spots there. So that's why it looks a little funny. This is... Seed availability. A lot of the seed stocks I was trialing, I had very limited amounts of seed. There's the trial at the end of August. You can see some downy mildew variation, and there it is again at a field day we did about it. A lot of grants, they want you to do field days, show other people what you're doing.
And we always learn a lot from having our field days and bringing people out, and just the discussions that take place, hearing other people's experiences. So it's worth it even on your farm to do that if you can.
Here's the trial looking real ragged in mid-September. Yeah, it's just great. And here's, I'm going to do a little comparison, pictures in late August. This is homemade pickles. It's not dead. Wait, okay, here's some dead ones. No, here's one dead one. Anyway, that's kind of our check. Marketmore 76, it's a popular variety. It is not the worst downy mildew resistant. This was resistant until the early 2000s. But when you have a trial and that dies, it makes a great picture and good trial. So this is one of Michael's varieties. This is the variety. This is the different breeding population that I'm working with from different sources. Anyway, just to give you an idea of, I really like working with the downy mildew because the results are so dramatic. Stuff just dies. Okay. There's a totally dead one.
Do you
Didn't-
rest the field after 1 year of trials, or do you rotate? When you're
I
doing
always
the next year of
rotate.
trials?
Yeah,
Since you like working with all this downy mildew and all.
we do basic crop rotation.
Okay.
Yeah.
But downy mildew is host-operative, right?
What does that mean?
It's, once the plant is dead, the downy mildew is dead.
Right.
It's
Right.
not staying.
It doesn't overwinter.
No,
Yeah.
not in this.
Unlike
I
the
thought
squash
some of it
bugs.
was in the soil.
The squash bugs definitely stick around waiting for Edmund to plant the squash.
But then you've got to think of what crop. So if you hear
Yes.
downy mildew like hops, it stays in that living tissue. So we will get downy mildew that just comes back year after year because it stays in living tissue. But annuals like this, it's everything dies, it should be gone. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, when I think about it, we're growing jaguan, which is a perennial, which comes back, and it's a cucurbit. I think it gets downy mildew.
And then that
Yeah.
possibly could carry that over in the plant. Yep, you're right.
Yeah,
Okay.
it might be building downy mildew, which helps us.
I think it's going to be okay. Real quick, so there's something called a breeding trial, which is different from a variety trial, and it's where you're planting everything in this breeding trial is from the same population, and what you're trying to figure out here is what the best plant is. But you could be taking data in a kind of similar way to a variety trial. You're just doing it, looking at each plant separately. But that's it's part of the project here is to breed a new variety. So, the downy mildew trial pictures I was showing earlier, I wanted to see how our seed stock did in comparison to other seed stocks. So the trial included this breeding stuff here, but it also included comparing that to other varieties. That's the breeding trial a little bit later. We finally have the final report posted from 2018, and in 2019, what we did, we didn't do a big downy mildew trial at our farm. We sent cucumbers out to other places to do trials, and that's our 2019 breeding trial, and that's a trial at North Carolina A&T University. That I went down and visited. I haven't gotten results back from anywhere really, but I'm very excited about that happening. That's at North Carolina A&T. And the last thing is that next year I'm really interested in doing trials with butternut. I've been working on this butternut variety for downy mildew resistance, and I really want to see how it compares to other butternuts on farms in the region. So if that's something you might be interested in, let me know.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you both. I want to give Patrick, you want to share a little bit about some of the trials you've done?
Well, and actually, why it took a long time back is
Okay.
I ran into a guy who got some pictures on there.
All
Can I
right.
help you bring some?
Yes,
over here?
like when I was
Let's put it
squash
up.
So, I wasn't doing trials, I did a class on cucurbits, I planted a huge variety, I did about everything I could think of in Baker's Creek. And just went crazy growing squash, and I learned a bunch of stuff. What I don't have to show is the summer squash, which in some ways to me was more exciting. And I'm just gonna spit it out fast. Caserta and Rugosa Friolana were in last year's Baker's Creek. They mess with you, they don't always have the same thing every year. But Caserta was a 1949 All-American winner, and they still grow it like crazy in Italy because it tastes great. Yeah. And people heard the, was it Ben Cuisinari or somebody who said that Romanesco was a squash to grow if you weren't thirsty? You know, all the rest were good if you were thirsty. Well, this tastes better than Romanesco. And there's two. There's Caserta, which was an All-American winner that we've forgotten about. Is it Casada? It's Caserta. Caserta. And okay, I'll just pull them out and pass them around. Yeah. Okay, so, and
Should just advance like a slideshow.
They want to touch the squash.
yeah, but right. So maybe I'll do show and tell first, and then I'll go to the slides as much as possible. Tahitian winter melon, right? Downy mildew resistant, not as much as I'd like, I have pictures from Highland Lake from years ago. A space not a lot bigger than this room. Many front-end loaders full of squash. So much Tahitian wintermelon squash, which who would grow this big a squash? A restaurant, right? But my boss had to make it that the chefs' pay raises were affected by how well they used Tahitian wintermelon. They were giving it away to people. I would show up someplace and there'd be Highland Lake's Tahitian wintermelon on their menu. And we didn't grow it for anybody but ourselves because they just couldn't handle how much we produced. Then, that's when downy mildew showed up always sometime in like mid to late August. You know, if it shows up earlier, this gets impacted a lot. So I got a nice amount of this, but for the 18 plants I put in, nowhere near the production of something like South Anna.
So I take issue with Elizabeth's comment. There is demand for these really big squash. These are what's used for processing. I worked with Gerber for years on these great big giant squashes, and more people realize
Super
the
high quality.
nutritional benefits of this. And yeah, restaurants and small processors.
They say this is the highest sugar content of any squash. I think that's totally got to do with conditions and fertility. You know, I mean, it's like.
So you might not sell it at the farmer's market to a 3-person family, but there's definitely markets for it.
But if I'm at the market, I can talk you into buying it. You know, and I'll give you the recipes, and you'll eat it all week, and you'll be grateful for it. You know? Pies, soups, stews. I mean, so Dickinson, and I've got a picture. This is a small one. But once again, I don't think it had the best downy mildew resistance. I didn't get nearly as many as I thought I should have for 18 plants. But some really gorgeous ones. I have yet to try this because we're curing it. But actually, looking in the catalog, they say it's got excellent flavor and it's dry, which is kind of rare with machadas. So I'm real interested to taste this one. I actually tried to get the restaurant to cook these for us last night, but they were like, no way. Too much work. That also is used as a Halloween pumpkin. I'm trying to stick with the machadas first.
They want the name again?
Okay, that is Dickinson. And I got a picture. You can get a 35-pound squash out of that. It's a really nice squash. You know? And I'm gonna mangle the pronunciation of this, but just go to Baker's Creek and look it up. It's something like Shishtangu. Yeah, it's.
I think I put Shishigatani, but.
Yeah, Shishigatani what?
I think it's Shishigatani, but.
Yes,
I mean,
it's Shishigatani. It sounds about right. Yeah. Yeah. Have you tried it yet? You tasted it?
Yeah.
And what's your take on it?
It's all right.
Just all right? Okay. Dave praised it a lot, and once again, my wife loves dry Japanese squash, so that's what I'm going for, and I'm real fascinated by dry Japanese machadas, because I spent much too much time spraying the Maximus for vine borer.
Just a comment too about some of these, what's important to a lot of people are how well they hold. So a lot of my trials, whether on my farm or with the university, is curing them and seeing how long can we hold them. We joke with the Seminole pumpkin that we can hold them over a year.
Oh, I've got one that's now going on 16 months. Yeah.
And that's important for people.
Yeah. But don't count on it because they can make a mess when they go. They can go from like totally holding to liquid overnight sometimes.
That's prepare restore.
Okay, so this is tropical pumpkin, right?
Is it Chinese?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. And so I just heard from Edmund, eat it before Christmas because the flavor changes. You know. But it's once again a dry machada, and I'm interested in dry squash, but I'm also interested in machada because I hate the spray.
It's probably related.
Okay. All right. This one I'm real excited about. Yokohama. I thought it was pretty productive. It seemed to take everything took it on the chin with downy mildew this year. Even the South Anna got hammered, but it just came back. And actually, have you ever had them taste bitter after that happens? I've had that happen once. That's really scary. I mean, squash can be bitter because of disease. And I made a wonderful dish for a potluck for my community, except for the squash was bitter as all that. And I of course didn't taste it.
You sure what?
I had that happen with summer squash pretty regularly.
You sure it wasn't genetic?
I know that it can happen. Disease can make squash be bitter. It's a response to the disease. And I run into it with summer squash often. I've only run into it once, and it was after a really vicious downy mildew attack, and we actually used copper sulfate to save the crop. And these guys were the few that made it before that, and I just took one of those early ones to make it for this potluck, and it was so bitter. And it's bad for you. Don't eat bitter squash. So this is actually, I guess, pretty, has a good reputation too.
What's
All these ones, it's a Machata, it's Yokohama. And it's noted for the recurving with the squash that sometimes grows completely over the stem. And all these Machatas, I'm pretty certain, they all turn a tan or chestnut in the end. They have great colors, enjoy them while they last, but they're all going to tan or chestnut. It's just, is there a Machata that doesn't do that? I don't think so. Yeah.
You say you start out like green or blue, but like by December or something?
Yeah, or something like that. They're all going to be, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not ripe, right? Like this is going to be good to eat right now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's going to end up looking like the Tahitian winter melon.
So we got about 5 more minutes just to warn you.
All right.
Hurry up, pick your
I made everything
favorites.
for things. Okay.
Yeah, keep it.
Am I through all the? No, Machatas. Still got to keep doing Machatas. All right. And help me out because I mix up the names of these two. The one's the Thai King Cobb, and then there's a Thai Ra Ka, whatever it is.
Yeah, Tarai Katak. I don't know which one was
Yeah.
which. They're both variable.
Yeah, they're both variable. They're wonderful. They're so variable. The flesh can be pale yellow, can be orange. I love these guys. The flavor can be all over the place, but I just love their diversity. They're all going to turn brown in the end. I mean, they're some of my favorite squash.
What are those?
They're Thai squash, and it's Thai King Cobb and Thai Ra Tak.
Tarai Katak.
Thai Ra Katak. And you got to label them to see which one's which. That's what I'll say. They're really hard to keep track of.
I don't know that they should really be different varieties.
Oh, maybe they shouldn't be different varieties. That sounds like it makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, so then finally, this is the discussion we're having. This is your Seminole pumpkin. And I was really interested because they all were this like consistent small size, which really, for a market grower, may really rock. We've got one market right now that wants squash that aren't too big. And I got tons of these from not very many plants. I
Do
just kept
those have
showing.
as hard a shell to them as the big ones do?
These ones hadn't been cured, and I can't stick my fingernail in them. Yeah. So yeah, they're your, but they may not have, they may have a smaller seed cavity. Is that one of the things you were breeding for?
It was like productivity and eating quality and bacterial wilt resistance, interestingly.
Yeah.
And Seminole always has the small seed cavity, that's one of the
So
traits.
What's that?
I think I'm now done with the Machatas.
Oh, no, our Seminole have a big seed cavity, unfortunately. It was one of the problems.
So mine have a tiny
Yeah,
one.
oh, that's awesome.
Well, mine came from David Bradshaw's program, so, yeah, and that was his big thing on it, is seed cavities.
Cool.
So these are the Maximas. This is a tiny one. This is Red Curie. This was the squash that everybody was drawn to, and people had to pick them early. Everybody had to have them. You want to sell at market. This squash just and it happens to be very dry and very flavorful. It's a total winner, and it was really productive. It totally got hit by downy mildew. I didn't not treat for downy mildew. We used Ecosedum, biodynamic prep, because we have a biodynamic person on the farm. And once we got that out, we first got hit by it though, and all we've been doing is a little bit of compost tea before that. Once he gave me that, I remembered we had regalia, so we used regalia, which is an extract from Japanese knotweed that raises the phenol levels.
Pat, I have a question.
Yeah.
Will you talk about your plans for variety trialing at your operation? Like,
So
how do you use variety trials, and how are you going to be using them in the future?
So, okay, to be completely frank, this was not a variety trial. This was an exposition. This was just like, I'm teaching about cucurbits, but I learned tons of stuff. I mean, because of what I did, because I had totally mixed in it, nobody got a break with disease. I mean, the disease pressure on these guys was incredibly intense. And what I got from that is which ones I'm going to grow, and which ones I'm going to grow where I can spray them a lot, and which ones I don't have to worry about spraying. It was purely happenstance that I lost track of where the Cuban neck pumpkin was because I wouldn't have sprayed it, because I would have assumed that it would have been resistant, to vine borer, but it probably would have all been killed. But because I wasn't sure it wasn't a Maxima, I sprayed it like crazy. The Maximas, all the Maximas are wonderful. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I want to also just make sure that people get a chance to ask questions about variety trials. How much time do we have?
None. You are 1 minute over time.
Yeah, so maybe I should just stop here and I can talk to people afterwards and throw some questions out about variety
What's
trials.
the name of that? You were starting to say.
That there is Red Curie.
Patrick, you were starting to say something about regalia that you treated.
Regalia is actually effective to a degree if you have really good fertility and you're paying attention to genetics, it helps with fighting downy mildew. It's not alone going to do it,
Right.
but it's a tool. You know, organic growers don't have the bomb. You know? We can't nuke stuff. We have to use every last little piece. You know, and regalia is a really good piece. I'm kind of over trying to use fungicides, and that's I'll talk to you in the hallway if I know about that. But I kind of a light bulb went off, and it's like we can't kill our way to health. You know,
So
I want to just do things that raise resistance. You know,
Yeah.
and
Who's a
things like
South
that.
Anna butternut?
Edmund just started passing around his squash, the South Anna butternut. He's very proud of it.
Oh, I think that he hit that out of the park with the South Anna. I couldn't recommend the South Anna more. I love that squash.
So-
And we grew an acre of it, by the way.